The 8th generation has been a weird time for video games. What started as underpowered machines more focused on watching Netflix than video games evolved into consoles capable of 4K resolutions with extremely strong exclusives and a more consumer-friendly approach to video games. In that time, we've had mid-gen upgrades, VR machines, backwards compatibility, and so much more building on what was already there. But how did we get there? What games pushed the boundaries? What moves did Sony and Microsoft make to push themselves ahead of the competition? And what does all this mean going forward with the Xbox Series X and S and the PlayStation 5? These are questions I aim to explore as I take a look back at both machines way back in 2013 all the way to today. Before we get into it though, consider dropping a like on the video and subscribe to see more videos like this. With that said, kick back, relax, and enjoy the video. In 2013, Xbox certainly had the rockiest start to this generation, a start many thought they would not be able to recover from. Always on DRM, games running at 720p on a next generation system, a lack of real focus on games, and being $100 more expensive than the more powerful PlayStation 4 because it included the Kinect no one asked for, all meant that Xbox going into the next generation had the deck stacked against them.
We have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360. That's your message if you don't, like it?
If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device.
They managed to get rid of the always-on DRM before release, but that didn't fix any of the console's other problems. Unless you were a devout Xbox fanboy or really wanted to play Rise Son of Rome, there wasn't much incentive to get an Xbox One over the PlayStation 4 in 2013.
And will continue to offer the best value on the market. I'm very proud to announce that PlayStation 4 will be available at $399.
The PlayStation 4 was getting pretty much everything right. Next generation gaming at an affordable $400 price point, consistently running games at 1080p, and a huge evolution of their controller made the PlayStation 4 seem like a massive step up over the PlayStation 3. The PS4 was clearly much more focused on games than the Xbox One was, and overall it seemed like a true next generation experience. What both consoles sorely lacked at the time was hard-hitting exclusives. Sure, Xbox One had Forza, PlayStation 4 had Killzone and Knack, but due to the lack of backward compatibilities, the likes of Halo, Gears of War, The Last of Us and Uncharted were still nowhere to be seen for the consoles, and the third-party games at the time, such as Battlefield 4, Assassin's Creed 4 and Call of Duty Ghosts, were all cross-generation games that didn't properly show off the power of the new consoles. 2013 was of course just the launch year though, and only a handful of games had been released on the console. 2014 was when the next generation truly started. It was also the year that remasters rose in popularity. With the absence of backward compatibility, a gap in the market was presented for developers who released their game towards the tail end of the last generation, didn't want to let their games fall to the wayside, and thought they had a chance of securing players' money twice. So the likes of Tomb Raider, The Last of Us, Sleeping Dogs and Grand Theft Auto 5, games that were only a year or two old at this point, all got next generation remasters that year, starting a worrying trend of developers trying to get players to pay twice for minimal upgrades for a video game they already own. Not only this, but some of the biggest releases in early 2014, like South Park The Stick of Truth and Dark Souls 2, weren't even released on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One at first. The first truly big release on next gen of 2014 was Watch Dogs, a game that had been highly anticipated for years, that was going to kickstart the next generation, and from its E3 demos looked absolutely gorgeous. Even though it also released on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, Watch Dogs was the biggest advertisement for a next generation console at the time. A fully interactive and immersive city full of actual people and not soulless NPCs, with a dark and gritty tone in a world of possibilities. Before its release, Watch Dogs was called a GTA killer. As we all know, it wasn't. The game released with graphics that were significantly worse than what was shown in the demos. The gameplay boiled down to your standard Ubisoft affair, and while the story wasn't terrible, there also wasn't anything particularly remarkable about it. It didn't bode well for next generation, and in early 8th gen, there was a lot of this false advertisement, a lot of false hype, and a lot of letdown. The middle of 2014 was mostly barren, with only mediocre games like Sniper Elite 3 to keep people interested, and the promise of more games at E3 of that year. However, video game season would come back in full force in September with the release of Destiny, a game that would shape many of the games to come out over the course of the 8th generation. Destiny was a looter shooter, games as a service game. Essentially, it was an MMO designed for consoles. Destiny wasn't designed to be a complete game at release, but as a service of which content would be slowly added to over the course of several years. Specifically designed to keep players playing for the best loot to get the highest number, it certainly succeeded at getting a strong core fanbase playing, and while Destiny was far from perfect, its success would inspire many more developers from EA to Square Enix to make their own game as a service, with usually poor results. The end of the year saw the likes of Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, Alien Isolation, The Evil Within, Dragon Age Inquisition, and Far Cry 4 released. All good games, but unremarkable. While they were of a sufficient quality, there was nothing that made players think they absolutely needed a next-generation console. Most of the games I just listed were also released for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, further cementing my point. The Crew was a new Ubisoft title, and while having all of the United States in one map certainly seemed impressive, unfortunately the content lacked the depth you'd might expect from a Forza or Gran Turismo game. Meanwhile, the big yearly franchises of the last generation, Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty, were going firmly down the shitter, with both Unity and Advanced Warfare making their respective developers the laughingstock of the video game industry. 2014 wasn't a good time for games, and the only trend that seemed to be on the up was the cheaper Telltale-style story games that were released in episodes. Luckily, 2015 was when things finally started to get good. 2015 was when Microsoft finally started to go about rectifying their mistakes with the last generation. With an E3 show purely devoted to games, a new Halo game coming out towards the end of the year, and backward compatibility being implemented so a handful of Xbox 360 titles would work on your Xbox One, things were looking up on the Xbox side of things. These were all thanks to new Xbox head Phil Spencer, a man who understood much better the direction the Xbox needed to go in. On the Sony side of things, they had managed to maintain their stability, and now had some very impressive exclusives that showed off the power of their console, like the Order 1886 and the excellent Bloodborne. Most games by this point were released solely on PS4 and Xbox One, meaning now the power of the consoles could truly be demonstrated. Now, if Destiny set the trend for multiplayer games this generation, this game set the trend for single-player games this generation. I am, of course, talking about The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Developed by not particularly large developers at the time, CD Projekt Red, The Witcher 3 was a massive open-world RPG full of detailed and sophisticated gameplay and a masterclass at storytelling and role-playing mechanics. CD Projekt released one of the best games of all time in The Witcher 3, offering amazing value for money with a huge amount of content and all of a consistent high quality. The Witcher 3 was a breath of fresh air at a time of poor developer practices. How they treat their employees is another story, but their attitudes towards consumers were certainly to be admired. The presence of CD Projekt Red meant that other devs needed to up their game in order to still have a spotlight on the gaming stage, and I think some developers may have took that a little too to heart as they bent over backwards trying to make the next Witcher 3. Meanwhile, video game remasters were still in full swing, with Dark Souls 2 and Borderlands being the latest additions. Rocksteady released their latest installment of the Batman Arkham franchise, a game I personally loved in spite of the tank battles, but received mixed reviews due to the aforementioned tank battles and poor PC port. Sony grew their exclusives library with Until Dawn, and Mad Max got eaten alive when it decided to release the same day as Metal Gear Solid 5, Kojima's next bewildering masterpiece that continued to pioneer the stealth action genre. EA brought back the Star Wars Battlefront franchise, a game that turned out to be a letdown as it ended up having a fraction of the content that the original 2004 and 2005 games had, and turned out to be not much more than pretty graphics and Star Wars sounds. Call of Duty Black Ops 3 was at least a bit of an improvement on the last game. Xbox released a new Tomb Raider game and a new Halo game, and the Just Cause franchise got another explosive installment with a fairly impressive physics engine. However, Bethesda were the guys dropping the big bombshell at the end of the year. Fallout 4, the next generation Fallout game. After both Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas were massively acclaimed, the hype for this was absolutely electrifying. I honestly miss the Fallout 4 hype. It was comparable to Red Dead Redemption 2 or Cyberpunk 2077. Everyone was hyped for this game. The whole gaming community was awaiting the 10th of November 2015, for that was when the game was released, and I remember it still to this day because of how hyped I was for it. And while Fallout 4 wasn't a bad game by any means, in fact it was great, it just didn't live up to the previous titles and took away a lot of the player agency and role-playing elements in order to make it more marketable as the more popular first-person shooter. I really like Fallout 4, but I don't love it, and knowing that this game was the start of Bethesda's decline in recent years has soured my opinion all the more. 2016 came around, and this was the beginning of the mid-generation upgrades. The consoles were already rather outdated machines way back when they released in 2013, and by this point 4K gaming was on the rise on PC, which boasted graphics leaps and bounds ahead of anything you could get on console. Sony had an answer to this, and it was the PlayStation 4 Pro. With the capacity to run most of the latest games in dynamic 4K resolutions, the PlayStation 4 Pro was undoubtedly a huge step up from the PlayStation 4, and console gaming seemed less like the cheap way to play your games. Meanwhile, they released the PlayStation 4 Slim, a more compact version of the original model, and Microsoft released the Xbox One S, a console significantly smaller than the chunky original Xbox One model, with the tease of Project Scorpio coming the following year, a console even more powerful than the PlayStation 4 Pro. The power limitations of the consoles had largely been addressed. Not only this, PlayStation released their own PSVR headset, which, while obviously still very limited, VR is nowhere near where it needs to be a viable option in most games. It did bring a good standard of VR for some games to the mainstream. From Software released another entry in their critically acclaimed Dark Souls series earlier in the year, and the success of the Soulsborne games by this point is getting developers to realise that there is an audience for difficult games. Sony released their best exclusive yet with Uncharted 4, a game that looks absolutely gorgeous and really pushes the PS4 to its limits, as well as being another entry in the amazing Uncharted series, with a classic Naughty Dog style storytelling and set pieces. The Doom franchise received a soft reboot, which received critical acclaim and set a new standard for first-person shooters, and the smash hit Overwatch was released, introducing the concept of a hero-based shooter to the mainstream, and games like Call of Duty would eventually adopt this. However, possibly the biggest scandal of the year came in the form of an indie developer of all things, Hello Games, and their PS4 and PC game No Man's Sky. Hello Games promised so many things in their procedurally generated open universe game, such as multiplayer, ringed planets, in-atmosphere battles, and much more, and none of it ended up actually being in the game at launch. Most of this was added to the game post-launch, and while No Man's Sky is a totally different game now that I'd recommend to anyone, the fact remains that at launch No Man's Sky was a barren universe of false promises that left a bad taste in the mouths of gamers and further damaged the trust the players have with developers. The year finished off with some more unremarkable games, such as Recore, the Xbox exclusive that no one remembers, Forza Horizon 3, another entry in Xbox's open world racing series, and yet another Xbox exclusive Gears of War 4. Xbox really blew their load in 2016, and it's so weird to look back at a time when Xbox exclusives were so frequent, considering we are currently in 2020 and have no AAA first-party launch titles for the Xbox Series X. Obviously, things went quiet on the PlayStation side of things either, as they released quite a few PSVR games when it launched, and The Last Guardian was released for the PS4, a peaceful puzzle game that manages to be great without implementing some of the ugly features of modern video games. The end of 2016 was also pretty much the golden age of remasters, with Skyrim, the Batman Arkham series, the Ezio trilogy, and the Bioshock series all being remastered. Ubisoft released their next Watch Dogs game, which ended up being another unremarkable open world, only this time without the benefit of a good story. Square Enix released their long-awaited new entry in the Final Fantasy series, which received critical acclaim, and continued to be a shining example of how to do a JRPG, and the stars aligned and EA actually released a good game in the form of Battlefield 1. Another Mafia game was released, and while it wasn't bad, it was still nothing on the older games. 2016 was a year with some good standout games, but nothing that truly went above and beyond, with the possible exception of Uncharted and The Last Guardian. Basically, even though there wasn't really anything that was terrible this year, the only people pushing the boundaries with their games were Sony, and this would set the stage for the back half of the generation. Then 2017 rolled around, with two major new console releases. The first was the Nintendo Switch, a console that, while still dwarfed by even the base PS4 and Xbox One in terms of power, offered strong competition in the exclusives market and meant that Nintendo actually had a stake in the game again, as they were drifting a bit with the Wii U. And even though this video is exclusively talking about the PS4 and Xbox One, I thought it was worth mentioning. The second console could not be more different from the first, from an underpowered console with many exclusives to an absolute monster with barely any. I am, of course, talking about the Xbox One X, and Microsoft really went all out with this console. It outperformed the PlayStation 4 by a significant margin, managing to hit full 4K resolutions in a lot of games, rather than the dynamic 4K that was primarily used on the PS4 Pro. It was a really powerful console, and Microsoft could finally say they were ahead of the competition in terms of power, a claim they hadn't been able to make since the days of the original Xbox and PlayStation 2. The year started with a return to form for the Resident Evil series with their 7th entry, which was truly the pinnacle of horror games for this generation and finally gave PSVR the big AAA title it needed. Xbox released the mediocre Halo Wars 2, and Sony came out with the first game to try and emulate the Witcher 3 formula, Horizon Zero Dawn, a story-driven RPG with the same numbers-based gameplay, a ton of side content, leveling system, and overall presentation that The Witcher 3 popularised. Luckily, Horizon was actually a good game, and the fatigue of Witcher clones had not yet kicked in, but it did set a worrying trend for games going forward. Meanwhile, Mass Effect Andromeda was released, which felt more like an insult to the Mass Effect franchise than anything else, with none of the substance or quality that went into the original trilogy, and facial animations that wouldn't be out of place on a PS2 game.
And your goddamn father. Sorry, my face is tired from dealing with everything.
2017 was also the year that I would say defined the generation the most, as with it came our generation-defining genre, that of the Battle Royale. First, it was PUBG, which was released on PC first and console later, but took the world by storm, with its rather simplistic gameplay which involved dropping 100 players into a rapidly shrinking map full of weapons, armour, healing items and vehicles, and the last player or squad standing wins. This was of course followed by Fortnite Battle Royale, which became a new face of casual video games, and everyone was playing Fortnite. The game got up to 3 million concurrent players at one point. Fortnite was in the news. There wasn't a single 8-year-old kid in the world who didn't know at least one Fortnite dance. It was easily the biggest game of the generation, the Minecraft, the Grand Theft Auto, the breakout game that you hear about no matter where you go. It of course wasn't your Witcher 3 or your The Last of Us, but for what it set out to do, it was a very fun game, which clearly must be at least a bit good, otherwise kids all over the world wouldn't be addicted to it. Whether Fortnite deserved the level of success it got compared to other games is up for debate. However, I couldn't make a video about this generation without mentioning the profound impact it had. After Fortnite and PUBG, every game was desperate for a Battle Royale mode, and they got one, from Call of Duty to Battlefield to Red Dead Online at one point. Video game season 2017 kicked off with the release of Destiny 2, a game which, while just a little disappointing at launch, grew to be much better in recent years. The release of Cuphead towards the end of September continued a trend started by Dark Souls in ramping up the difficulty in video games, all while being a standout game. Assassin's Creed was back from the dead in RPG form, and in Assassin's Creed Origins case, it nowhere even scraped the quality of The Witcher 3. However, on the other hand, Call of Duty finally started getting good again and returned to its roots with its World War II setting. However, the controversy that defined the year came in the form of the sequel to EA's 2015 Star Wars shooter, Star Wars Battlefront 2. From everything we saw about the game, it looked to improve the original in every single way. It had content from all three Star Wars trilogies, a campaign, improved gameplay and graphics, and the removal of the Season Pass. All this seemed a little too good to be true coming from EA. What was the catch? The catch turned out to be microtransactions. The game was absolutely bogged down with loot boxes that were pretty much essential to buy if you wanted to make good progress in the game. Either that, or you could spend your whole life grinding. Without microtransactions, it would have taken 40 hours just to unlock Darth Vader alone. Clearly, EA saw the success of their EA Sports games and thought they could replicate that in their other popular franchises. The response to this was huge, especially on Reddit, where an EA executive made history by posting the most downvoted comment in Reddit history, citing giving players a sense of pride and accomplishment for their ridiculous over-monetization. After a short period, microtransactions were removed from the game in the final release, but this greatly damaged EA's already piss-poor reputation in the gaming community, and led to the depopularization of microtransactions in video games in favour of the more agreeable battle passes, and debates were made by several governments over whether microtransactions should be considered gambling. It was a pretty bombastic way to end the year, and even though EA's business practices were downright offensive, overall it turned out to be a good thing for gaming as a whole, as developers were far more hesitant about over-monetizing their game going forward. As 2018 rolled around, Fortnite and PUBG continued to blaze in their popularity. Both consoles now had the capacity to boast high-end graphics, and as I just stated, the loot box controversy with Battlefront 2 continued to play a profound effect on the industry. However, 2018 was less a year about hardware, developer controversies, and industry trends, and was more a year about games, and oh boy, the games of 2018 were absolutely outstanding. As early as January, we got the outstanding indie platformer Celeste, which I'd highly recommend to anyone who hasn't played it. Meanwhile, Konami were trying their hand at making a Metal Gear game without Kojima at the helm, and as anyone could have predicted, it didn't go well for them, being some sort of online zombie shooter survival game loosely connected to the Metal Gear franchise, but without any of the charm or indeed quality that Hideo Kojima brought. Xbox dropped Sea of Thieves, which was one of those games that sounds really fun in concept but works less so in practice. High sea adventures with your friends? Yes please, but the gameplay ended up being rather boring and a bit finicky. The sort of gameplay that looks really good in those E3 demos where all the paid actors work really well together, but less good when you're playing the game and the person you're playing with is an 8-year-old with a Kinect mic and who just called you the N-word. Ubisoft released Far Cry 5, which was definitely Far Cry, another standard Ubisoft open world watchtower shooty affair that we've all come to expect. Nothing particularly bad and nothing particularly good. Weird enough, it was EA innovating with A Way Out, an always co-op story-based game which, while wasn't really a standout game by any means with really lackluster gameplay mechanics, it at least tried to do something different. God of War was easily the biggest release of the first half of 2018, which was essentially a soft reboot of the franchise, featuring older, bearded Kratos and following this weird industry trend of having a kid follow you around the whole game, which is a weird tactic developers have been using a lot lately in order to try and give the game more emotional resonance or something, because as we all know, if your story isn't profound or sad enough, add a kid. Regardless of this, God of War was still an excellent game that pushed the PS4 to its limits, and the game is really truly cinematic. You follow one camera angle pretty much the whole game, which is both impressive and immersive. The story is excellent, the graphics are beautiful, it's only the gameplay that really holds it back, and even then it's only slightly. The combat isn't the most engaging, and the enemy variety isn't exactly the most, well, varied. Regardless of all that though, God of War perched itself firmly as one of the best games of the generation in the eyes of many critics, and cemented Sony as the absolute king of exclusives, a fact they would only continue to prove over the next 2 years. The summer brought us Ubisoft's sequel to The Crew, which dropped the less than perfect story of the first game to have a more gameplay focused approach, a decision that worked a lot better for the franchise. However, things really started to get good as the summer drew to a close with the release of Marvel's Spider-Man, a game that managed to capture the spirit of Spider-Man better than any of the movies from the past decade ever have, with a fantastic emotive story and gameplay that is probably the most genuine fun that I've had out of a AAA game this generation, with web swinging that feels fluid and straight out of a comic book panel, engaging combat, all while being a very streamlined experience which is very fun without feeling bloated. It takes more than a few cues from the Batman Arkham series, but is that so bad? The Arkham games are really good, and now, with the release of Miles Morales 2 in 2020, we have a Spider-Man video game franchise that can stand toe-to-toe with it, and its place as a PlayStation 4 exclusive puts Sony on an even higher pedestal than they already were. Microsoft released another Forza Horizon game to critical acclaim, which is just as well because by this point it's pretty much the only exclusive they've got going for them. And Ubisoft released Assassin's Creed Odyssey, easily the most egregious of the various Witcher clones out there, a soulless RPG without any meaningful gameplay, opting instead to focus on a game of who can get the highest number. And Activision released Black Ops 4, a Black Ops game without a campaign, a strange decision as the campaigns of the Black Ops games tend to be their strongest asset. Instead, they opted for a Battle Royale mode, and the oversaturation of the genre began as every single shooter franchise under the sun milked itself dry trying to replicate Fortnite, which was a bit like trying to catch lightning in a bottle. We all know what the big boy game of the year is though, that's right, Red Dead Redemption 2. After Rockstar vanished off the face of the earth for 5 years, emerging only to put GTA 5 on another console, or update GTA Online every time they were only making $1 trillion a day rather than 1.1 trillion from their shark cards, they were back with my personal favourite game of the generation and possibly of all time with RDR2. Telling the prequel story to the first game, the story is one of the most emotional, well written, well acted and well presented ones on the market, with a protagonist in Arthur Morgan that I would say is unrivaled by any other game. This is all done in a gorgeous, beautiful open world which keeps you immersed the whole time you're playing the game, with an expertly crafted gameplay loop, and the linear nature of the missions allows for a much more cinematic experience. Other than some minor gripes I have with the game prioritising realistic physics and weightiness over less concrete controls, the game is damn near as close as you can get to being perfect. And if you haven't played it, which I'm sure you have, pretty much everyone has, I couldn't recommend it more. You absolutely need to play this. If you don't believe me, believe the Game Awards, in which Red Dead 2 won pretty much every award except from Game of the Year, and even then that felt like it was more of a consolation prize to God of War to make things seem fair. 2018 wasn't all sunshine and rainbows though, it also brought us Fallout 76, which was pretty much the nail in the coffin for Bethesda after they spent the last few years trying to monetize community mods, release Skyrim on as many platforms as there are on Earth, and after Fallout 4 couldn't hold a candle to the previous installments in the franchise, Fallout 76 was a buggy, broken mess which expected players to pay full price for an online game with no NPCs, no engaging gameplay other than what was already available in Fallout 4, and was in general just a terrible, soulless game that no one was asking for. What we were asking for was the Elder Scrolls 6. but all Bethesda gave us was a 30-second teaser, the promise of it coming at some point between now and the end of time, and patronising comments towards people who wanted to see more of Bethesda's most played and most popular franchise, which hasn't seen an installment in nearly a decade. Fallout 76 sent Bethesda Game Studios' sinking ship right to the bottom of the ocean, putting them in a compromising position for the release of their upcoming next-gen title Starfield, a game which to me is Bethesda's last chance to mend their reputation. The end of the year brought us Just Cause 4, a game that somehow managed to look worse than its predecessor, and Battlefield 5, a fine game by all means, but like Just Cause 4, its predecessor Battlefield 1 was better in almost every way. 2018 brought us some of the most amazing games of the generation, but it's important to note that it was also home to many mediocre to average games. 2019 was another one of those unremarkable years, a year full of 7s and 8s out of 10s, but no truly standout games that blew people away. Now, at this point it was becoming obvious that the next generation was around the corner as Microsoft announced the Xbox Series X towards the end of the year, and whilst the PlayStation 5 had not been properly announced, it was pretty implicit that Sony's next console was also coming. Meanwhile, Google announced Stadia, of which some would argue is the future of games. However, I would argue that for most people in 2020, your Wi-Fi connection isn't reliable enough to invest all of your video game needs into. Meanwhile, ray tracing was becoming a thing on PC graphics cards, setting the stage for consoles to implement the feature the following year. The start of the year saw the release of Kingdom Hearts 3, so if you're a gay anime child who watches Disney movies all day, you finally have the game you waited a decade for. Nah, I'm joking. I know the Kingdom Hearts games are good games with deep stories, they're just not for me. And regardless of my enjoyment of the franchise, fans getting the game they've been waiting more than a decade for, and for it to be critically acclaimed, isn't something I can avoid discussing when doing a retrospective of the generation. Crackdown 3 finally got released after like 5 years of teasers, and somehow still managed to be a mediocre game after all that time. Far Cry New Dawn took soulless Far Cry game to the next level by doing some shitty all-online game, and EA tried their very, very hardest to be Destiny and failed spectacularly, putting BioWare at the head of an online service game because, as a developer of single-player RPGs, there was obviously no better team suited to the job. Anthem was just another grindfest that tried to be Destiny but wasn't, with more money put into the marketing of the game than actually making it, and I'm pretty sure the game is already almost dead just a year after release. I can't remember the last time I heard anything about Anthem anywhere. So yeah, live service games were finally dwindling after pretty much every developer started to realise they weren't Destiny. Sony continued their plight, releasing Days Gone, a PlayStation exclusive, which, while not as good as some other PS4 exclusives, was still rather good, and certainly better and more meaningful than anything Xbox was putting out at the time. The most noteworthy game they had was Gears 5, which, while not bad by any means, didn't do anything that hadn't been done before. A new Borderlands game was released which, while good, didn't replicate the quality of the previous games. Obsidian released The Outer Worlds, which surprised everyone by being a better RPG than anything Bethesda had put out since Skyrim. Kojima released his PS4 exclusive title, Death Stranding, starring Norman Reedus, being an excellent and bewildering game that takes bold risks and does things that have never been done before, showing that game design can continue to innovate. EA finally did the impossible and released a Star Wars game without a major gaping flaw or controversy, and this came in the form of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, a semi-linear style game following a Jedi on the run following Order 66, which actually turned out to be an excellent game thanks to developers Respawn, with realistic combat that plays good, a fair amount of challenge, a huge variety of options in combat and abilities to unlock, all while taking you to beautiful Star Wars environments over the backdrop of an amazing story with many thrills. This is truly the Star Wars game I want EA to continue to publish. So on the whole, while the year did have some really great games, there was no amazing 10 out of 10 games, just a really satisfactory year for games, and once again games continued to be the focus rather than shitty peripherals as was common in the back half of the last generation. And that brings us to the year we're currently suffering now, 2020. Regardless of global pandemics and other international catastrophes, this year has been a really good one for games. The pandemic actually caused a boost in video game sales due to everyone being at home. This is a video about the last generation, but we couldn't not talk about the announcement of the next generation consoles. Microsoft had already announced the Xbox Series X, but we got more details on it, and we now know it has replaced the Xbox One X as the most powerful console in the world, along with the announcement of the Xbox Series S, an alternative for people who maybe can't afford an Xbox Series X or don't have a 4K TV. Meanwhile, Sony have announced the PS5, a console which, while not quite as powerful as the Series X, is still an insanely powerful machine and also boasts an innovative controller and strong exclusive lineup to boot. In short, both consoles are in a much better position than they were 7 years prior, with Xbox being an underpowered machine and PlayStation lacking the amazing exclusives they have today. And of course, both consoles were released about a month ago, bringing the 8th generation of gaming consoles to an end. But we've still had a lot of amazing games this year, some of the best of the generation in fact, so let's take a look at them. Early in the year, we got Modern Warfare's response to the Battle Royale genre in Call of Duty Warzone, and I will admit this is the game that came closest to replicating the popularity of Fortnite, and their key decision to make the game free to play is what caused this. And the gameplay actually did enough to shake up the Battle Royale genre that it didn't just feel like another Fortnite or PUBG clone. A new Ori game was released, which was a fun Xbox platformer, and I'm fairly sure the only major exclusive they even brought out this year. A good game by all means, but obviously lacking in the scale you'd expect for the sole Xbox exclusive in a year their next-gen console was released. And of course, we got Doom Eternal, another installment in the gory, fun, exhilarating horror shooter franchise which, like its predecessor, still stands atop the first-person shooter genre. Square Enix put out 1/3 of a PS4 exclusive Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was of course an excellent game and faithful adaptation of the original game, but while it was huge, only actually had about 1/3 of the original game's content, with the rest of the game being released later, which was a bit disappointing. Not long after, The Last of Us Part 2 was released, a game amazing on a mechanical, visual and technical level, and it was hotly anticipated the entire generation, but ended up letting a lot of players down with the storytelling decisions they made, and let's be honest, it wouldn't be the 8th generation of consoles if we didn't have at least one bit of disappointment left. Meanwhile, Ghost of Tsushima became the Assassin's Creed game that Ubisoft never made, and was actually good, finally giving us a Japanese ninja samurai-esque game worth its salt. In Xbox's defense at the time, Microsoft Flight Simulator was released, a game that's only on PC for now, but which is coming to Xbox One and Series X soon. I have no idea how this game is going to run on Xbox One, but I can honestly see it being a big system seller for the Series X, so it's not like they were doing nothing games-wise. The elephant in the room for 2020 though is of course the gross sexual misconduct allegations that have plagued the industry over the past year. Insomniac Games and EA both suffered from these, but perhaps none more so than Ubisoft, where many executive level staff at Ubisoft were accused of sexual harassment and misconduct, which caused a lot of players' trust in Ubisoft to be further shaken, and with these problems now laid to bare for the world to see. I'm so glad all this came to light. It led to many Ubisoft executives being dismissed, and the major problems in the industry, not overpriced DLC or season passes, but gross sexual misconduct, now finally being tackled, although these game developers and publishers still have a long way to go to deal with these problems. Later in the year, Square Enix brought out their take on the Destiny clone, that being Marvel's Avengers, which turned out to be another shitty live service game that died in a matter of months. It just looked embarrassing next to things like Insomniac's Spider-Man games. It was just a terrible mess of grinding for useless things designed to sucker you in with absolutely no depth or engaging gameplay whatsoever, with a story that was mediocre at best. In fact, I'm pretty sure even now, 3 months after the game's release, it actually still hasn't earned back its development costs, which is downright embarrassing for a franchise as big as the Avengers and a publisher as big as Square Enix. EA released an unambitious Star Wars game called Squadrons, focused on ship combat rather than a huge story or intergalactic ground battles, and I'll admit it was nice to see a more focused and compact Star Wars game for a change. It reminds me of the days when LucasArts were the guys putting out Star Wars games. And Ubisoft released Watch Dogs Legion, which surprised everyone by being a Ubisoft game that actually pushes the boundaries with its play as anyone mechanic. The story of course suffers from this, it lacks the focus and the quality of the previous two games. However, I genuinely think that the gameplay loop of Watch Dogs Legion is one of the most fun and fluid experiences Ubisoft has put out the last few years, so I can't fault them for that. The year continued with the release of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, an Assassin's Creed game that was actually good and faithful to the franchise, while Black Ops Cold War was released and turned out to be a disappointment for many fans. While this was happening, the next-gen consoles were released and the 8th generation was officially over, spanning from 17th of November 2013 all the way until the 10th of November 2020. However, just because new consoles are out, of course that doesn't mean support for the 8th generation of systems were automatically dropped. Expect to still see games released on the PS4 and Xbox One well into 2020, and there are even still a few games from this year to talk about, so let's get into them. The first is Spider-Man Miles Morales, the next of Insomniac's excellent Spider-Man series, which, as we all know, was a launch title for the PlayStation 5, but also released on the PlayStation 4. A shorter experience, the game still looks and runs beautiful on PS4, and all the engaging gameplay and story that's in the PS5 version is in year 2, although perhaps without the stable 4K resolutions, 60 FPS frame rates and ray tracing, which was a really good way to round off the generation. And as the year ends, there's only one big game left, Cyberpunk 2077, which at the time of recording this is still about a week away. I'm not sure if it'll be released by the time this video is up, but it looks to be the biggest release of the year, and if Miles Morales was a good way to round off a generation, Cyberpunk is an explosive game to end it. The first game developed by CD Projekt Red since The Witcher 3, unless you count Gwent or Thronebreaker. A game that looks gorgeous, fun, deep and engaging, and that I'm sure, like its predecessor, will shake the industry in some way. So to sum up, 2020 has been a massive year for games, possibly the biggest one this generation, and on the whole, it's been a positive year, which means the next year will either continue this train of excitement or let us all down, like 2014 did before. But I'm sure it won't. So that's it, the entire history of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, all the way from their announcement to the release of the next generation consoles. The life cycle of these consoles, as I said, is far from over. Hitman 3, Far Cry 6 and Hogwarts Legacy are just 3 games coming next year that will also be available on the PS4 and Xbox One. So if you still have an 8th generation console and don't plan or can't get a new one yet, don't despair, you've still got plenty of time and plenty of good games in that time. The only game you're really missing out on is Demon's Souls, which is the sole PS5 exclusive. But for now, after the long period of reflection we've just been on, it's time to look to the future, to the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, to the RTX 3000 series of graphics cards, and see exactly what the future is holding for gaming. And if the past year or two or any indication, gaming is looking up. Well guys, that's the video done. A lot of work went into this one again, so if you could drop a like, that would be very appreciated. Comment your thoughts on the last generation consoles. Tell me which next gen console you're planning to get and why. And if you want to see more videos like this one, hit the subscribe button, or if you want to be an absolute lad, you can share the video with your friends. With that said, thank you guys for watching this video up to this point, and I'll see you guys in the next one.